Hello, everyone. Welcome to Community Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Noah Mintz. I'm the event coordinator at the bookstore. Community will be celebrating 50 years in business this fall, and we credit the continued support of readers and writers for this milestone. Thank you for spending the evening with us. I'm thrilled today to welcome Laura Marris for a discussion of her new translation of Albert Camus' The Plague, in conversation with Alice Kaplan and Adam Dalva. Tonight's event is also brought to you by the National Book Critics Circle, who will be launching a new prize for work in translation starting with the 2022 publishing year. The Greg Barrios Book in Translation Prize, named after critic and longtime board member Greg Barrios, will honor the best book of any genre translated into English and published in the United States. For more info on the prize, visit bookcritics.org. Now to some housekeeping. We've enabled Zoom's auto transcribe setting, so if your version of Zoom is up to date, you can click the live transcription button on the bottom of your screen to enable closed captions. If you have any questions for tonight's guests, please click on the Q&A button, also at the bottom of your screen, to submit them. We will be asking those at the end of the program, so please don't be shy. There's also a chat box through which I will be posting a link to buy tonight's book if you haven't already. And one caveat for tonight is that we're all at the mercy of our home internet connections and server loads, so please bear with any technical issues that might arise. We'll try to resolve them as quickly as possible. We've also scheduled a whole host of fall programming for you, so head over to our website, communitybookstore.net, sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date. One that I want to point out in particular is next Tuesday, November 16th, we're thrilled to welcome Isabel Fargo Cole for her new translation of Wolfgang Hilbig's The Interim in conversation with Rachel Kushner. That program is up on our website now and taking registrations. Now a little about tonight's guests. We'll get started. Laura Marris is a writer and translator. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Believer, The Yale Review, The Point, and elsewhere. Her work has been supported by a MacDowell Fellowship and a Daniel Varoujan Award. Her translations include Albert Camus' The Plague, out from Knopf now. Books she has translated have been shortlisted for the Oxford Weidenfeld Translation Prize, the Bale Gifford Prize in the UK, the Mark Linton History Prize, and the French-American Foundation Translation Prize. With Alice Kaplan, she is the co-author of States of Plague, Reading Albert Camus in a Pandemic, forthcoming from the University of Chicago Press. She's currently at work on her first solo-authored book, The Age of Loneliness, which will be published by Grey Wolf in 2024. Alice Kaplan is the author of Looking for the Stranger, Albert Camus and the Life of a Literary Classic, and editor of Camus' personal writings and committed writings for Vintage. Again, she's the co-author with Laura Marris of the forthcoming States of Plague, and she teaches at Yale, where she directs the Whitney Humanities Center. Adam Dalva's writing has appeared in The New Yorker, The Paris Review, The New York Review of Books, and The Guardian. His graphic novel, Olivia Twist, was published by Dark Horse in 2019. Adam serves on the board of the National Book Critics Circle and is the book's editor for Words Without Borders. He teaches creative writing at Rutgers University. So now without any further ado, I'll hand it off to you all. Laura, Adam, Alice, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. That was always such a pleasure to be here with Community Bookstore. And before we start tonight's programming, I'm especially excited tonight that this is the first event in honor of the National Book Critics Circle New Translation Prize, which is launching next year. It's been a multi-year effort by many board members to celebrate books in translation. And we thought what better way to kick off our season of promoting this than with a wonderful new translation of Camus that after reading it in the last couple of weeks, I can immediately tell you feels essential. And Alice and Laura, I'm so thrilled to be here with you tonight. So we thought we might begin with a reading from Laura from her fabulous translation.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to Community Bookstore and to everyone at Knopf and to Adam and Alice and to everyone here. I'm so glad that we are launching this. It's been a long time working on this in isolation, so it's very nice to work on it, to be able to share it with you. So I'm going to read a short passage. I don't think that there's much context that's needed, but I did want to read this in honor of all of the couples who were finally allowed to reunite yesterday at airports across the country. So this is from maybe about the first quarter of the book. And if you're following along for any reason, it's on page 74. The first thing the plague brought to our fellow citizens was exile. And here, the narrator is persuaded that he may write, on behalf of everyone, what he himself went through, since he experienced it at the same time as many of our fellow citizens. Yes, it was the feeling of exile, that hollow we carried constantly within us, that precise emotion, the desire to go backwards, or the opposite, to hurry the march of time, these burning arrows of memory. If, from time to time, we let our imaginations go and amused ourselves with waiting for the sound of the doorbell to return, the familiar step in the hall, if in those moments we consented to forget that the trains were stopped, if we arranged to stay home at the time when normally a traveler carried by the evening express might have arrived in our neighborhood, of course, these games could not last. There always came a moment when we perceived clearly that the trains weren't coming. We knew that our separation was destined to last and that we had to try bargaining with time. From then on, we generally reverted to our prisoner's condition. We were reduced to our past. And even if some among us were tempted to live in the future, they quickly abandoned it as much as possible when they experienced the wounds imagination inflicted on those who trusted in it. In particular, our fellow citizens quickly denied themselves, even in public, their habit of speculating about the length of their separation. Why? Because while the most pessimistic had guessed it would last about 6 months, when they had exhausted in advance all the bitterness of those months to come, hoisting their courage with great effort to the level of this trial, extending their last energies to remain firm at the height of this suffering stretched over such a long series of days, so that sometimes a friend in passing, an opinion in the newspaper, a fugitive suspicion, or a harsh clairvoyance gave them the impression that, after all, there was no reason the disease wouldn't last for more than 6 months, for perhaps a year, or even longer. At that moment, the collapse of their courage, their will, and their patience was so quick that it seemed they would never again climb out of this hole. As a result, they compelled themselves never to think of the date of their release, to no longer think of the future, and to keep their eyes down, so to speak. But naturally, there were no rewards for this caution, this way of deceiving sorrow, of shutting down their defenses to refuse the fight. While people held at bay the collapse they wanted to avoid at all costs, they deprived themselves of those moments which were otherwise quite frequent, when they could forget the plague with images of their future reunion. And like this, stranded midway between these abysses and summits, they floated more than they lived, abandoned to directionless days and sterile memories, wandering shadows who could only gather strength by deciding to take root in the country of their sorrow. But if this was exile, in most cases it was exile at home. And though the narrator had only known the same exile as everyone else, it is important to remember those like the journalist Rambert and others for whom the opposite was true, as the pain of separation was amplified by the fact that as travelers surprised by the plague and stuck in the city, they found themselves distanced from both the person they wanted to join and the country that was their own. Within the general exile, they were the most exiled because though time elicited from them, as from everyone, its own form of suffering, they were also tied to the space and collided endlessly with the walls that separated their plagued refuge from their lost homeland. These were surely the people who could be found wandering the dusty city at all hours of the day, calling in silence for evenings only they knew, and for the mornings of their country. They nourished their pain with enigmatic signs and disconcerting messages, like a flight of swallows due at sunset, or the bizarre rays the sun sometimes abandons in deserted streets. And I think I'll leave you there.
Bravo. Oh, how fabulous. All 82 people here are applauding right now, I would think. And many more watching on YouTube after it's posted. So a quick question from me before our conversation begins. You write in your beautiful afterword a quote from Camus, "The problem in art is a problem of translation." And you say, here Camus identifies the fundamental difficulty of translation, which is making a viable world out of words. So I wanted to start by just asking what drew you to these words, what caused you to want to do this translation?
That's such a lovely question. So I first read this book in college, in a class, in a seminar with Alice Kaplan, no less. And it actually, it intrigued me because a lot of the things that people say about it struck me as sort of untrue to the fabric of the text itself. So this book has been called, studiously unbeautiful, and things like that. There's just this sense that this book was like kind of philosophical in its makeup and in its textual fabric, but I actually find it really lyrical, and I wanted to read that image about the rays abandoned in deserted streets because it's one of my favorite images in the book. And to me, there was this kind of alternation in the original between the kind of lyrical moments in the text where Camus describes the weather, he describes kind of the movements of the city. And then there are these more philosophical moments, a little bit like the one I just read, like the beginning of it, where you can really feel the weighting pulled in those sentences. Actually, when you read them aloud, they make you kind of breathless. And you can really feel the anxious waiting of people separated from their loved ones in that grammar. So that alternation of more lyrical passages and more philosophical ones, I thought made the text really dynamic. And that was something as a translator and as a writer that I kind of wanted to learn from, but I also really wanted to try to capture in translation. And apart from that, I mean, I think the Camus estate, Alice, you can speak to this as well, but the Camus estate for a long time has been interested in a new translation, and people had been asking for it. So before COVID, I got this project. And so I never imagined that I would be working on the translation under those circumstances. But in a way, it became like the strangest companion.
The strangest COVID companion imaginable.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll have a chance to talk at some point about traveling in Algeria and actually walking the novel. I mean, I've learned so much about this novel from you. I mean, despite having read it, many, many times, taught it many, many times. And I decided that there could be something called reading like a translator. People talk about reading like a writer. Well, you taught me how to read like a translator. I mean, there are certain passages in this book that your translation work helped me see anew. For example, the swimming scene. The swimming scene has always been read as really, really positive, this utopian moment, this respite from the plague. And when I saw it through your translator's eyes, I saw that there was rat, there was the rat body right there in the water. It really changed my understanding of the book. And you also helped me understand how close Camus is to the weather and how the characters are always looking at the sky. And people have said to me that during COVID, they found themselves obsessed with the weather. I don't know what that's about, but don't you think that Camus had this remarkable intuition of what we're going through?
Yeah, I think that the weather is such an interesting kind of fixation in the plague, because in a way, when there is a crisis happening, and when you have these really intense scenes where people are suffering and where people are kind of coming up against this situation that is bigger than themselves, there's somewhere the eye has to go after that. And so often the narrator's eye turns to the weather or to the sky. And at first I thought it was kind of a stylistic thing, like dynamic narration, pulling down the intensity a little bit by giving us a passage that focuses on the natural world. But then the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the weather actually holds so much tension. because some of Camus' sources for this were, older plague chronicles that were from medical professionals in, 16th, 17th century, and they really believed that warm weather would bring disease. So the rising heat in the novel isn't just a motif that is, something else to talk about besides the disease. It's something that in the minds of many of the people in the book, it causes disease and it brings on more. So the weather is kind of like the ticking time bomb in the background. And it's also, it has that capacity to build tension, but it also has the capacity to be like a marker in time. So, at this moment when so-and-so died, I looked at the sky and it looked like this. And that's kind of a way of like universalizing these memorials and putting them somewhere they're visible, which I also thought was really kind of a beautiful way to make a marker for the most dramatic scenes in the novel.
Okay, Alice's question, which is so wonderful about reading as a translator, and Alice, what you're saying about looking at this novel as a lens for 2020 and 2021. I was so struck, and I was wondering if the translation, this was a challenge, that a lot of the heat of the panic of the novel is in the first part of it. And then as it goes, as the characters, which very much echoes, I would say, March, April 2020, and remember Governor Cuomo's press conferences and all the rest of it. And then by the end, the characters, although they are literally dying, seem quite numbed to the experience of the pandemic. And I don't know if I've read a book that takes on that structural conceit. And I was wondering how, and this really builds off Alice's question of reading as a translator, how you approached that.
Yeah. I mean, Dr. Rieux has this really difficult line. I think it's right around the beginning of part 2, where he says, in order to fight an abstraction, you had to resemble it a little. And, he, in the first months of the plague, he has all this empathy for his patients. And he actually feels relief as that starts to leave him, because it means he can go to more houses in a day. He can last longer. It's in the interest of helping more people, but in a way he feels like emotionally he has to shut down in order to be able to do his job. And I thought that was really interesting and difficult, because it's also, I think, in the context of the book, which was initially, written as an allegory for the Nazi occupation of Paris and the resistance during World War II. Even though we might come to it in a very different way now, I think that that moment in the text still really raises some questions for like how we think about heroism, and some of the things about, asking people to be heroic in ways that were really problematic. And I think throughout the play, Camus really refuses an easy kind of heroism. And to go back to the swimming scene, it's definitely represented there. He has this moment where he just says, like, they got back to work. And to him, that's the most heroic thing. You keep doing your job, even though your job is impossible. And to call it heroic, I think, usually for him, that was kind of a problematic label. Like it came from the outside, like from governments who were sending people to war, for example, and using heroism as like a label that would help them go to war. So Camus doesn't want to avoid that, but he still wants there to be like an ethical function of doing your job well in a really difficult time.
You bring to mind my favorite, Joseph Grand, who is the most unheroic and yet, always going back to work. And I think Rieux is almost tempted to call him a hero. He says, if there was going to be a hero in this book, I think I'd give it to Joseph Grand. But it also, thinking about what you said about the emotions and looking away from people, looking at the sky. I mean, Rieux can almost only feel emotion looking at Grand cry.
Mm-hmm.
feel it for himself. That's another thing that you helped me to see in the book, that incredible scene where he stumbles upon Grand looking at the shop window and remembering his life. So heartbreaking.
Yeah. And that's kind of, I mean, the plague is full of mirrors between characters, you know, people who are unable to feel immediately their own emotions, but they project them onto someone else or something else. And then we're kind of able to see what they're feeling through what they observe. And to me, that was really comfortable because that's sort of the space of lyric poetry. Like the eye, you know, watching someone's eye and what they observe to try to learn how they feel. So there's the moment when like Rieux looks at the rat that's just come down the end of the hallway and like spun around and died in front of him. And instead of thinking about the rat, he starts thinking about his wife who has tuberculosis, because the rat, you know, when it dies, like spits out a little bit of blood. And it's such, you know, you just know how worried Rieux is in that moment because of how he observes this rat and how improbable that projection is.
Yeah, and he turns around and walks up the stairs, right? That leads me to another question, which is the question of restraint in Camus' style, and why in holding back the obvious emotional outburst, he allows us to feel so much when we're reading. I mean, could you say a little bit about how you see that working and how that was a guide for you in translating to be true to that restraint?
Yeah, that was something I really wanted to restore when I came to this project, because Camus' restraint is really something that powers the book. It's one of the major tensions, I think, that gives the book its emotional power. And it can fall flat if you're not careful. Some things he says with such simplicity carry a lot of force in that they aren't kind of really flowery in their language. But it's easy to kind of tip that balance one way or the other a little too much, you know? And so I was always conscious of that, like not trying to make the language either more elevated and kind of flowery than it was in the original, or to kind of flatten it out too much. But I think
that becomes the stranger. You don't
well,
want to...
he's the same writer, right? I mean, they're very different books, but he has capacity. And that flatness, I think it's so strange because there is some of that same stylistic moves in The Stranger, where images are very kind of sparse and spare. But it's because of the we that it never has quite the same flatness. It never has that kind of personal narration of someone who has just shut out all kind of emotion from the world. But that, not to digress, but yeah, to get back to your question, I think that restraint as a translator is such an interesting question, because I didn't, you know, obviously I was living through COVID while I was doing this. And so I had to work really hard to not put my experience of COVID into the book. And, you know,
you had to be restrained as well and not over-identifying. I mean, you had to have a serum and not a vaccine.
Right. Well, there are things in the book, like I could have made the politicians in the book sound more like the politicians on my TV, you know, but I wasn't going to do that. I think there's a kind of important distance between the original and the translation that allows it to breathe. And for me, that kind of came about through my sense of restraint, and also my sense of wanting to like let someone who's reading this and picking it up for the first time have their own reading experience, rather than trying so hard to communicate what I think Camus was trying to say.
Which is a good time for me to confess that this is the first time that I read The Plague. reading your wonderful translation of it. My experience with
Lucky
Camus was
man.
I played the Arab in L'Étranger in a school play in high school, and that was the extent of it. And I am lucky. One thing that I was noticing in terms of restraint as I enjoyed this book the last few weeks was the delayed narrator and the restraint of the narrator and the documentarian role the narrator plays, perhaps especially in kind of an astonishing gambit to my mind of the third part of this novel, which turns into almost direct reportage of a fictional world. Alice, when you were asking about textual restraint, I was wondering, Laura, if also that narrator, we might spoil the identity of a bit later in our talk. I'm not sure yet. I don't know if spoilers count.
You mean the holding back on the
holding back of the narrator's identity, and then the curious way that the narrator's identity as someone who's a chronicler of events and not a fiction writer like our favorite character. I wonder how that affected the translation for you, Laura, because it's an odd voice.
Yeah. He's quite anxious about that in the beginning of the novel, before he even starts telling his story, he just says, these are my sources, and like I didn't see everything, but I saw that I was told a lot, and I witnessed some of this and I lived through it, but he's kind of giving you an invitation to trust that and you can either reject it or accept it. I think either way you end up on the side of that invitation, it's still a really interesting voice, because there's so much in that that's quite complicated, because we's can kind of co-opt experience, but then they can also try to pull people back into a sense of solidarity that might be fracturing. And I think there are moments in the text where that kind of does fracture. For example, in that really dramatic conversation between Rieux and Taru on the rooftop, where we totally get all of Taru's backstory. But I'm glad that you brought up Taru, our favorite character, because I think Taru's role in the book is so important, because in a way he kind of offers like a chance to come up for air, like to escape from the for a little bit. And in his notebooks, you get this kind of reversal of the sort of big history of the larger plot arc of the book. But in Taru's journal, you get like instead this very particular like telescope turned around, tiny little stories that are happening in the neighborhood, and those are some of my favorite moments in the book.
Like the spitting on the cats is always a perennial favorite. So it's you've got the and you've got like Camus knows his own grandiosity in a way. I mean, he's a journalist, he's writing in Combat, it's 1945, he's a hero. He's almost fighting his own heroic rhetoric of the post-resistance world in creating the guy who's interested in spitting on cats and, the people in the neighborhood. I think it is a wonderful balance in the book.
Yeah, I like what you said too. I mean, and for me, the really individual stories that Taru brings into the book, they give it another kind of ethical layer. Reminding people of the insignificance of people's lives, but how important that is. Like Camus has this amazing moment in his notebooks right around when he discovers this idea of insignificance and decides to bring it into the book. And, he says, the way I turn my doorknob, it doesn't matter to anyone, but it matters to me. And so there's just that sense that like all these tiny actions that make up people's lives are irreplaceable. And it keeps the book from feeling like this just kind of mask of catastrophe, to use a great phrase from Deborati Sanyal, but like it keeps it from feeling like there's no escape from the kind of arc of a plague narrative.
And as both of you know so much about Camus and have a book coming out next year about your kind of conversations, how would you contextualize this among the rest of his work? How does The Plague stand out? How is it separate? How and I'm also just wondering if you could both talk a bit about your shared literary project.
Yeah, I mean, contextualizing The Plague, gosh, he wrote The Stranger in about 6 weeks. He was he felt like he'd been holding it in himself, and it just came flowing out when he found himself alone in a hotel in France, separated from everybody he was close to. But The Plague, he had a lot of trouble with it. He agonized over it. He wrote it, he rewrote it, he eliminated, there's a character named Stéphane that he eliminated entirely. He was going to be this kind of suicidal classics professor. It's kind of hard to...
How could they cut that?
All right. All this stuff about Thucydides. Anyway, there were a lot of plot lines that got abandoned. And down to the last moment, he kept writing all his friends and saying, The Plague is a disaster. We've got to get rid of it. It's so abject. I don't know why anyone would want to read it. But, it had so much more success than anything he ever wrote. It sold so many copies right away. And he would say, oh my God, The Plague has more victims than I thought. He was embarrassed by his success. And I think for him, it was all tied up with, in a way, his embarrassment about having become an icon of the resistance after the war. He just wasn't comfortable with that fame. He just felt that it was false. And I think he was writing through some of that in the book.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, to speak to our project, it was actually such a helpful thing for me in kind of trying to process working on this during the time that I did, and to have like an interlocutor. So every week for about a few months, Alice and I would send drafts back and forth. And in the end, we ended up with this book where our essays alternate. And so it's really just about reading this novel and working with it during a pandemic, and just thinking about how it connected to our lives and how we felt like in the moment of reading it, some of the passages felt so true to life that the original allegory that has kind of surrounded the book since it was written, and in the tradition in which it's taught, where it was always taught as like an allegory of World War II, that kind of collapsed in a way because our lives surrounding us came so close to what was happening in the novel. And, I felt like, I think at the beginning of the pandemic, like I felt like I was the least helpful friend to so many of my people I was talking to, because they would say, well, maybe I'll just go to visit my mom for a couple days and then I'll come back. And I would say things like, well, listen, like we're in a pandemic, like wherever you go, you should be ready to stay there for, 6 months to a year. And they looked at me like I was crazy. And I was thinking like, but no, it's in here. I wasn't even thinking about it.
You knew something. You knew
Plague
something.
expert.
So I found myself in this weird Cassandra position at the beginning of the pandemic.
I didn't feel like I was writing a book with Cassandra. We had some light moments.
You have to leave that to the critics.
It was super interesting because, I'd always taught The Plague in order to teach the occupation of France. I'm an historian. And so with Laura, I could do the history part, and I actually did do a lot of work on, for example, Oran in the 1930s and the fascist mayor of Oran, things like that. And then Laura would come in on the environment, and it was just so eye-opening for me. So we do have these alternating voices in the,
Yeah.
in the book. And also alternating geographies. At first I was in France and thought I was going to be stuck in France, and then I got sick. And so, you know, there's a little, I mean, it's not autofiction by any means, but from time to time there, we use our personal experiences.
Yeah, I think also neither one of us wanted to write it alone. We got to be, we got to make like a tiny conversation.
It's true. I mean, we weren't, you know, we were so, it was at the moment of the greatest isolation that we wrote the book. You know, those days of Cuomo press conferences, you know, and the clanging of bells at the end of the day, and the sound of sirens overwhelming everybody, and just being super scared.
Wow, I can't wait to read. Promise me we'll come back for that. But now back to the plague. We've actually had a couple questions in the chat about the prior translation by Stuart Gilbert, I believe. I was going to say Gilbert in the tone of the night, but I think it's probably Gilbert. So Laura, we wanted to maybe ask you to talk a bit about your process in relationship to this earlier translation. And we thought one way to do that might be that I would read a very brief passage of Gilbert's, and then Laura would read her translation and then compare her process a bit with those two. So this is on page 256 of Gilbert, I believe, and it's very short. So I will read. Again. They dressed and started back. Neither had said a word, but they were conscious of being perfectly at one, and the memory of this night would be cherished by them both. When they caught sight of the plague watchman, Rieux guessed that Taru, like himself, was thinking that the disease had given them a respite, and this was good, but now they must set their shoulders to the wheel again. Yes, the plague gave short shrift indeed, and they must set their shoulders to the wheel again.
Thanks for reading that. Okay, so this is my version. Once they were dressed, they left without saying a word, but they had the same heart, and the memory of that night was sweet to them. When they noticed the plague sentry from afar, Rieux knew Taru was thinking, like him, that the disease had just forgotten them, and this was good, and that now they must begin again. Yes, they had to begin again, and the plague didn't forget anybody for long.
So can you talk a bit about the differences between those two?
Yeah, this is actually a really interesting moment for translators, I think, because translations weren't always, there used to be, I think, a little bit more tolerance for a bit of embellishment. But there are no wheels or shoulders in the original. So, you know, they had to put their shoulders to the wheel again is a totally mythological addition to what's actually in the original. And when I was looking at that, the question I was really asking myself is, why was Stuart Gilbert so uncomfortable with the original there? You know, why did he feel the need to edit so much there? And I think part of that answer has to do with the fact that he, like Camus, had lived through the Second World War. You know, he translated this in 1947, 1940, and then it came out in 1948, just a year after the original novel came out. So, I mean, maybe that, I'm purely speculating here, but I get the sense that there's kind of throughout the text a discomfort with Camus' moments that are most simple, and that Gilbert kind of feels that there should be more appropriately heroic language in some of these places. So when I see something like that, I kind of had to stop myself and think too, like, what am I bringing to this text? Because there has been this weird parallel. You know, we are hopefully emerging from COVID in this moment in the same way as when the original novel came out, they were emerging from the Second World War. And I hope that in my own translation, I haven't added my own spin along the lines of put their shoulders to the wheel. I don't think so. but yeah, I think there, it also comes up to differences between my translation and Gilbert's. Gilbert liked to add quotations where Camus has free and direct discourse. He liked to, I don't know, tidy up the text that way. And he also sometimes liked to add a paragraph break where there isn't one, or add a semicolon where there isn't one. I remember that from reading about Camus' response to seeing the first translation of The Stranger. He said, he couldn't really read the English, but he said, you know, I don't think I ever put that many semicolons in. And so to me, that's like, it's the discomfort with the length of the sentences, which is something that happens quite often because French sentences can generally carry a little bit more length than English sentences can. But I left them to bend the rules of the English language comma as to the nth degree. But
I think that teaching Americans French syntax, I'm all for that.
We love an aggressive comma.
Yeah.
You know, I think your analysis is historically really sharp, because what Gilbert seemed to be uncomfortable with is the possibility that it wouldn't be epic enough, that this allegory of World War II would just be too simple. And one of my students noticed that Gilbert uses the phrase wine dark sea, was all excited because, you know, she'd read Homer, and it was great to find that Camus was using this Homeric language. Well, no, it was Stuart Gilbert using it. The other thing to say about Stuart Gilbert is he was very, very involved in the first translations of Joyce. He was actually on the team of people translating Joyce into French. And I think he picked up some Joycean habits. I think he wanted his Camus to be more Joycean than Camusian, you know.
Oh.
Yeah, I've had to break a couple hearts of students as well. You know, that moment you just read where it's the plague in Gilbert, it's the plague gave short shrift indeed. And short shrift is an idiom that's so particular. It means literally to give a very short confession before someone is executed.
Oh my God.
And so in the context of the plague, it's super weird. Because Camus was pretty much an atheist.
And hated the death penalty more than anything.
Which is a plot in this book.
Yeah, that's this thing about the death penalty, which it isn't in that moment. And I just, yeah, there's some little things like that where, you know, you can see the analysis of the essay spinning for someone who's looking at that, but it's not there.
And at the same time, I remember you saying it's a very accurate, I mean, there aren't any contresens, there aren't any mistakes, per se.
Yeah, there are
additions and paraphrases.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, you're both being accused in the chat of being too kind to Gilbert, but I won't address that.
Well, he's so easy. He's too easy a target. You gotta have some sympathy for him.
No, vibes are good. I think it's good.
That's funny.
Now, speaking of the Q&A, before we get to it, Alice, I know you were hoping, and I was also hoping to ask Laura about her experiences actually traveling to where this book is set.
Yeah. And in fact, I guess I'd like you to talk about, Laura, about what it means to place a translation, you know, to have a translation be grounded. You've written about this, to have it be grounded in the sense of a place.
Yeah, sense of place is really important to me in translation, even when it's a novel, you know, and even when, like, as in Camus' case, you know, his experience of Oran was French colonial Oran. You know, it's this like settler occupied city, which is very different from Oran today. But really in his, you know, when we went there and we walked around the city, which we were very lucky to be able to go, To me, this is such a book of walking around the city. The characters are just constantly in the streets, like moving between neighborhoods, and that also felt very contemporary to my own plague experience. Like for so many months, all we were allowed to do was walk. And so to me, being able to actually walk around the city and get a sense of how far the neighborhoods are apart from each other, and to talk to experts like our friend Abdelhak, who like runs an amazing nonprofit in Oran that does these walking tours of the city to kind of give the stories behind different landmarks. To me, that gave the translation so much more depth because I was able to actually see some of the images from the landscape that Camus was writing about, and kind of try to get inside the connotations of those places that when what they might have held for him. And to me, that kind of layering of what I had seen over what's in the book just helps for me to make the translation a little bit more real, like the texture of the place a little bit more fully realized. And that was especially the case with this plague cemetery, which was this old cholera cemetery built outside one of the old Spanish forts of the city. And it was actually built on top of this defensive labyrinth. So when the Spanish took the city, they made all these defensive tunnels to defend it from the Algerians who were trying to come and retake the city. And so Camus placed this plague cemetery, and in the book he describes it, you know, these huge mastic trees, and that place actually exists.
I can remember driving around with you and you say, oh my God, it's a mastic tree. And there it was, the branches coming up over the wall of the cemetery.
I had to learn the like ecologically accurate translation for that kind of tree.
And then I remember too, when we went into the theater, you know, the scene of the opera.
Orpheus and Eurydice, what a scene.
Yeah, and the chairs were velvet, you know, of course they were velvet.
We were standing outside of the theater in the pouring rain, looking at the facade. And one of the people who runs the theater opened the doors and like, just come in.
Come in.
You two look like Camus readers.
Well, we had come from a really, really far away, and they were very kind.
Oh, I love that. That's one of my favorite scenes in the book. And if we had many more hours, I wanted to ask about it. But I do want to make sure we hit some of the questions in the Q&A, which I think you both are equipped to answer all of them, looking at them. So question, I'm going to go kind of in the order I see them. In your views, is the plague more of a tragedy or a comedy? And does this new translation favor one element over the other? It's a good question if the translator makes that noise.
Yeah. I think that there's, I would say it's neither. It's a chronicle. It's something that attempts to have in fiction the texture of an oral history. It's something that attempts to kind of gather different sources and create a document that, yes, has like a fictional arc because we know it's a novel. But I think it's too balanced at the end to be a tragedy or a comedy. You know, we have, and I don't want to spoil it too much.
If anyone, let's just play this game. If you don't want to be spoiled, hit mute. Laura spoil, and I'll go like this when it's safe to come back. Okay, so mute. Go, Laura.
Yeah, so, you know, we come to the end of the book and there's this huge, you know, street party basically happening throughout the city. And so it feels like there's such a victory. But at the same time, you know, Rieux is absolutely devastated. He's lost almost everyone he ever cared about, right? So it's kind of impossible to imagine that this book has a kind of ending that would make it either a tragedy or a comedy. Instead, there's this sense that this book is a contained moment in time, but that the circumstances that created it could always return. And that's why I think having a little bit more distance from its initial publication date, we've kind of seen the way this book can come back and be relevant to different moments in the world as our own history evolves. And so, you know, that kind of a chronicle, it's the book you pick up when you're wondering, you know, what the hell's going on. And in that sense, it doesn't offer like a neat resolution that would classify it as either a tragedy or a comedy.
And while we're in the spoiler box, I just want to add a second spoiler question. And then Alice, I want to hear from you.
Yeah.
So the second spoiler question in the chat, you know, this is just for us junkies who love the plague. To what extent and how does Camus question to withhold until the final passage the revelation that Dr. Rieux, who I would have considered the protagonist, and the narrator are one and the same, impact, enhance, or detract the idealistic appeal to heroism?
Well, yeah. I mean, by saying we and not revealing himself, he's able to speak for more than himself. So Camus could have written the story of his experience during the occupation, you know, and his own heroic deeds during the resistance. And he would have had a historical novel about World War II that might have done pretty well. And he took this other path because he was more ambitious and he wanted a book that could escape its own time, that would be actually very much of its own time, that would be very accurate and would escape. I mean, I guess that's the beauty of allegory, that it can both be really concrete and travel endlessly through time.
Yeah.
Laura, are we in spoiler-free zone, or do you want to add a bit more there?
No, I think it just, for me, it goes back to that idea that Rieux is quite anxious about his we, that he doesn't want to, if it's too easy to know who the we is, it's too easy for the we to collapse into a kind of I. And he doesn't want it to feel coy. He has all these kind of other characters who are also have writing projects, who are potential foils for the narrator, you know, who are kind of narrators in possibility. And to me, that's kind of an honorable thing. I think it makes the character of Rieux more convincingly ethical, and that he hasn't taken on the idea of telling the story and narrating it as himself.
It's funny, I mean, a lot of people feel that they know it's Rieux within a few pages, but I think in some sense that doesn't matter because it's the gesture of withholding. And Camus was very, in this book that he supposedly disdained, he actually had a lot of one aspect. I mean, he wrote to his friend Louis Rieux and said that this absent narrator is the whole magic of the book. It's the secret of the book. And that if it works, if he could get it to work, that the reader would want to go back and start rereading once they'd gotten to the end and found out who the narrator was.
I thought it was the priest, but then events transpired that made it very clear it was not the priest. All right, let's get rid of the spoilers. So come back.
No, the Camus technique worked for you. That's exactly what he
100%.
wanted to happen.
I was like, I can't believe it.
You didn't think it was Tarot, or you didn't think it was Albert?
I thought I had it all the way. Okay, back to Q&A. Spoiler-free zone. I'm just going to take them in the order I see them. Under the Nazi occupation, fighting against the plague had to be done in secret without attracting attention. Does that contribute to the idea that letting go of the emotional involvement was part of being able to work effectively against the disease in the novel?
That's interesting. I wouldn't have connected it with emotional detachment. I would have more connected that kind of anonymity during the resistance. The fact that you really couldn't, people were tortured, right, in order to say the names of the people who were in their network. So you could make a link between that and not revealing the name of the narrator.
Yeah, I think that the more that I read The Plague separately from the context of its original conception, the more I think that there's this whole other thread going on, especially because it's really important to remember that Camus was really ill when he was writing this. He had tuberculosis. The reason he got separated from his wife when he was writing this, the reason he was in France was because he'd been sent to do like a mountain cure. And so that really created like this whole framework for him of immunity and resistance, and of having like an illness dormant in your body that flares up. And so I think he was really, instead of having this idea of like secrecy, it's more this idea of dormancy, that, you can have these social ills that lie dormant in the civic body for a really long time, like authoritarianism or nationalism or racism, and they can then rise up if people don't take enough care to understand their history or to do their memory work or to kind of inoculate themselves against the possibility of these social ills happening. So I think that there's maybe something in your question that kind of gets to that. But for me, it's more dormancy than secrecy.
Fascinating. A question in the Q&A. Many of the leading characters are men. What can you say about the importance of any female characters in the novel?
I would say that also, as a woman, representation isn't always as important to me as it is to have women characters be written well. But there is a very powerful female character at the heart of the book, who is Rieux's mother. And Alice, maybe you can speak to her presence.
I mean, she has got an incredible care ethic. And in fact, she's the one who helps Taru die. She's in the room with him. She's, giving him water and caressing his forehead. And he looks to her. I mean, it's very otherworldly. He looks to her for permission to let go, I think, to sink into the waters of the plague. I mean, she's very, very powerful in her silence. And there is some connection to Camus' own mother. He writes about his own mother, sometimes in similar ways, his own mother who was deaf and illiterate and incredibly powerful to him.
I also thought the decision by Camus to send Rieux's wife away and to put other female characters sort of outside the scope of the novel actually kind of spoke to a female, like the female non-presence felt very intentional, at least in this book.
Absolutely. He says in his notebooks, this will be a world without women. And I think for him, a world without women is a plague-ridden world, right?
To say the least, we can all agree on that one.
But it was also true, I mean, as I mentioned, that at the time he was writing this, he was separated from his wife. So when Rieux sends his wife away, that's Camus kind of transposing his own experience. So in Camus' life, he was the one sent away and his wife was the one who ended up remaining behind in Oran. But I think by reversing the roles, he kept the book from coming too close to the personal there. He didn't want this to be necessarily directly associated with what his own life experience was, because again, I think that would have made him too much the focus of it and made his character too close to Rieux's own.
Well, believe it or not, that actually brings us to the end of our hour together. It's well past midnight where Alice is, so she looks especially surprised to hear that.
This has been so much fun. It's really kept me very much awake. It's great hearing from both of you.
So glad.
Yeah, thank you all so much. This was a real pleasure, and the hour went by very fast.
Too fast.
It sure did. Yeah, thank you all so much for doing this. I'm back. Laura, congratulations on the book. All three of you, thank you so much for this really fascinating conversation. It's such a joy. There's a link in the chat to buy the book if you haven't already. And we hope to see you at another virtual event very soon. Thank you so much once again, and take care, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Take care.